joyous moment to break his heart and destroy him. So Mom is very upset. Ted had said that if we sent him a letter, he would burn the letter, not read it, so don't even bother. And Mom and I were talking, well, what are we going to do? We got to tell him we love him. So Mom got this idea, maybe if we send him a postcard, he's got to see it, right? So we both sent postcards, and all we said on there, Ted, we love you with all our hearts. And, she said Mom, and I said Dave. We sent those postcards. About 4 or 5 days later, I got a FedEx from my brother. Now you can imagine, this guy's living out in the woods, and to do a FedEx for Ted was unthinkable, and it was desperate, and it was basically the most disturbing letter I've ever read, saying, you are killing me, and now the whole world knows, because of this postcard, that there are problems in our family. He felt so violated, so exposed, and it was so strange to us, and then we showed this to the psychiatrist as well. And, the psychiatrist basically looked at the letter, sat me down, and said, David, I can't do a diagnosis based on some letters. That's not how we do things. But I have to say, your brother is highly, highly paranoid. There are strong paranoid features here. There's some symptomology, there's some aspects of these letters that you have to say are consistent with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Your brother, just talking to your brother or a counselor would probably not be able to help your brother. Probably need some kind of chemical treatment and counseling together. Your brother is so hostile to the idea of treatment, to the notion that he's mentally ill, that it's probably going to be very tough to get him into treatment. And at that point, I think we confronted what so many families confront, the sense of helplessness. You have an adult family member who's very, very ill, but who may not recognize that they're ill, who may not understand that they desperately need treatment. And yet, there's no way the family can get that person into treatment without going to a court of law, without proving that they're an imminent danger to themselves or others. I imagine that Ted would just absolutely, if there was any hope of reconciling with Ted, it would be totally lost if we took him to court and tried to prove that he was mentally ill. That would be a violation of him. I think he would feel terribly, terribly threatened by that. With the help of the psychiatrist, we actually kind of hit on a strategy which was to try to contact the doctor, I believe in Helena, a cardiologist, talk to the doctor. He had, as one of his delusions, the belief that his heart was going to fail on him. And he had mentioned the name of the doctor, so I called the doctor and explained what the psychiatrist had said, sent her some of Ted's letters or copies of some of Ted's letters, and said, he seems to respect you. You might be the only person who would influence him to get him some mental health treatment. And I think, again, awareness, here's a person who's dealing with the heart, not with the psyche, not with the mind. And her reaction was to say, well, he seemed okay to me. I mean, there was nothing that seemed strange about him to me. The only thing that seems strange to me, he's convinced that his heart is bad, and we tested his heart. It's like the healthiest heart I've ever seen for a man his age. And there were a couple of phone calls, but I think she probably felt uncomfortable. Her loyalty was to her patient, not to her patient's family, to have these conversations. Her patient's back probably felt like some ethically somewhat difficult for her. And we were basically left at that point kind of hoping for the best, hope someday Ted will awaken from this, come back to us, seek our help because we can't seem to help him if he rejects us. Life went on, 4 or 5 years go by. We got occasional letters from Ted. They were cool. A couple of the letters asked for money. Once we sent him $1,000, another time we sent him $2,000. And I thought, gee, I hope he's not sick. I hope he's not starving. Gee, I hope he's using that money to get some help, some treatment. Everything changed, though, in September of 1995. I remember coming home from work one day, and Linda was there to meet me at the door, which wasn't really typical. She has a busy life. She's a college professor. She's not Jim Cleaver. She was, welcome home, honey. But she has a very very troubled look on her face, and I said, is something wrong? And she said, David, I think you better sit down. So we walked down our hallway to our living room. We sit down on the couch. Linda puts her hand on my knee. The first thing she said is, David, please don't get angry at me, but... And I'm thinking, okay, what did she do? Did she still spend a lot of money? Did she put it into the car? You know, I love Linda. I'm a forgiving person, I was about to say. All is forgiven. But then she said something that absolutely left me speechless. She said, Dave, I've been reading some of these articles about the Unabomber. You've heard of the Unabomber? Has it ever crossed your mind as even a remote possibility that this person could be your brother today? I didn't know what to think. I mean, to me, this was coming out of the wild blue. And, you know, after I sort of recovered from the shock of this, I said, well, what would even make you think that? And she said, well, you know, in some of these articles, they're pointing out that they believe the Unabomber came from Chicago because the first bombs had been planted there. Of course, we'd all grown up in Chicago. And then she said, apparently, one of these bombs had gone off in a student lounge at the University of California in Berkeley. I didn't teach there at one time. I know it was years ago, but so those were two pieces. And then it was at this point that the Unabomber had actually sent his manifesto to the newspapers insisting that it be published. It was just a critique of modern technology. And it hadn't yet been published, but it was leaked that it was an anti-technology manifesto. And so she's putting that together, Chicago, Berkeley, anti-technology, saying it's probably a coincidence, but maybe these are pieces of a puzzle that add up to your brother. And my reaction was to say, Ted has never been violent. He's never threatened violence. I cannot imagine that Ted would just attack people. I mean, he may be sick, but he's not evil. Ted couldn't do this. And the way we left it, Linda said, well, would you just at least, if the manifesto is published, please read it and tell me what you think? And I said, fine, sure, of course. About 5 or 6 weeks went by, the manifesto was finally published. I tried to get a copy of the Washington Post that day. There aren't many distributed in upstate New York. It was actually about a week later that Linda had heard it had been posted on the internet. I had never been on the internet in my life. We didn't have it at home, but we went to her college library. We were sitting looking at this computer screen for the first time. I realized Linda's sitting kind of kitty corner to me, and we pull up the Unabomber's manifesto. I'm beginning to read it. And I'm aware that she's not actually looking at the screen. She's looking at my face, I think, realizing that my face would tell her more than the words on the screen. And I'm all set to read that first paragraph, find something that disqualifies it as Ted's writing, and I'm going to turn to her and say, look how silly you've been, you know. And I just got a chill, you know, and I'm reading it, and you know, there's some things that connect to some of Ted's philosophy. I didn't think it was an absolutely unique philosophy. A lot of environmentalists out there who might deal with some of the same things. The emotional tone of it, I felt almost like when I was reading that angry letter from Ted, it almost had the same sort of emotional effect on me. You know, at this point in history, I believe the Unabomber investigation had become the longest-running, most expensive criminal investigation in U.S. history. They had been looking for the Unabomber for 17 years. They were apparently clueless. A couple dozen people had been injured. 3 people had actually been killed. This was a case that consumed the public imagination. It inspired fear all around the country. And here's Linda, you know, we're suspecting, is it my brother? And, you know, we weren't about to talk about it in a public library. But, you know, the moment we walked out the door of the library and we're walking back toward our car in the parking lot, Linda says, well, Dave, what do you think? Do you think Ted could have written that? And I said, look, I'll be honest with you, some parts of it do sound like Ted. Other parts really don't sound all that familiar to me. If I had to estimate, if I had to guess, I'd say maybe there's 1 chance in 1,000 that Ted wrote the manifesto. And Linda gets very quiet, very thoughtful. We're walking along, and she said, David, 1 chance in 1,000 that your brother's the Unabomber? That's not insignificant. You know, maybe we should look into this. Maybe we need to do something. I was certainly not prepared at that point to make a call to the FBI. You know, I knew that they there had been problems. There had been attempted arrests of people in Waco, Texas, and in Idaho. Innocent people had died in certain cases. I didn't want to just call the police on my brother. I thought, gee, we need to find the truth some other way. I guess we thought we could find the truth in the manifesto. Linda's a philosophy professor, so she's attuned to language, ideas. I had been an English major. We thought if we read deeply into the manifesto, we could find the truth. It also happened that because Ted had no telephone, the way we communicated over the years was through the mail. And I had saved almost all of his letters for many years. And about 100 of those letters I had in a drawer in our home. So for the next few weeks, we'd come home from work, Linda from the college. I was working in a youth shelter for runaway and homeless kids in Albany, New York. We'd come home, we'd have dinner, and then we'd go back to our couch. We'd be reading the manifesto again and again and again, 78 pages long documents, comparing passages in the manifesto to those letters, And I have to say, sometimes I just look at it and think, what am I doing? Have I lost my mind? My brother's the Unabomber thing. It's serious, it can't be. But there were other times when I'd be reading the manifesto and it would almost sound like Ted's voice in my ear speaking those words. And I think, interestingly enough, what finally, turned things for me wasn't anything we discovered. I researched in the library all these articles, I saw the Unabomber sketch. I heard about the people who had been killed. I was looking for some way to rule Ted out as a suspect. I found some things that eyewitness description described somebody 3 inches taller than Ted, different hair color, estimated to be 10 years younger. That was all encouraging. The manifesto sounded so much like it. But at any rate, I woke up this one morning and had a crushing sense of depression. I remember as I first woke up, my first thought was, gee, that was the worst nightmare I've ever had in my life. And then as the cobwebs sort of melted away, I realized, hey, you're not having a nightmare. You're literally considering the possibility that your brother is a serial murderer, the most wanted person in America. And I remember walking to the breakfast table, sitting down. Linda was sitting there, just eating a bowl of cornflakes. And I just looked up at her. I didn't plan to say this. It just kind of welled up out of me. I looked up at her and I said, hon, I think there might be a 50-50 chance that Ted wrote the manifesto. Linda was really forced to look at this through my eyes. And up until this point, I had been finding every reason to believe it absolutely could not be Ted. And here, finally, I was validating her suspicion. And you can imagine she was very, very upset. For the rest of that day, we wrestled with it, like, is he or isn't he? Could he be? Could he not be? But also, the question of what we needed to do, what our responsibility was here, began to surface for us, and we were wrestling with this too. By nightfall, we were lying in bed, but not finding sleep. We turned off the light. We're talking about it. Even the word Unabomber was too scary to use, but we're talking about it. And I begin to realize, a whole other dimension of this is starting to dawn on me. A more personal question: do I really know my brother? I thought I knew him. We grew up together. We shared a bedroom together as boys. We spent many happy days together out in the woods, family outings, Christmas. I thought I knew him. What the Unabomber had done, it was evil kinds of things. Had I grown up with an evil human being? Had I been just so naive or so blinded by family loyalty that I couldn't see who Ted really was, a monster? And so I began sharing with Linda that question and then stories about Ted. And I told Linda one story that had a very, very powerful effect on me. I told her that when I was about 3 years old, our family had moved from an inner city neighborhood in Chicago. It was called the back of the yards. The yards were the stockyards, and that was where Polish people lived and worked in the stockyards. My father had been a sausage maker. But he saved his money, and we bought a house out in the suburbs. And for the first time, we had our own single-family dwelling to live in. It was also the first time I had a backyard that I could play around in as a little kid. And I used to push my way out through the screen door we had and play around in the backyard. But it was tough to get back inside the house because at the age of 3, I was so short, I couldn't reach the doorknob. So I stretches, never could reach it, couldn't pull the door open, and I'd stand out in the back patio crying for somebody to let me in. And this went on for, a while until one day, Ted, who was about 10 years old at this time, came out of the house, and I saw him fiddling around at the back door. I walked up there thinking, what's Teddy doing? And he had taken this little spool of thread, and I saw him remove the thread. He took it from Mom's sewing kit, and he got a hammer and nail from Dad's tool kit in the basement. He put the nail through the spool. Back then they made the screen doors like out of wood. And he was nailing this spool onto the screen door. And when he's done, he says, Steve, see if this works. And all of a sudden, it dawned on me what he'd done. He'd made me a little makeshift door handle. And from that day forward, I could get inside the house. Well, think this 42 years later, I'm struggling with this awful question. Is my brother the Unabomber? Whoa, this memory floats up. I hadn't thought about it in years. As a 3-year-old kid, I took it for granted. He was big, he was smart, he did nice things for me. Now I'm thinking, is he a serial killer? Wow. Anyways, I'm sharing this memory with Linda. I hear a little sound, and I kind of look at her face on the pillow next to mine. And there was enough light coming through the shade from a street lamp outside so that I could see her face, and it was just flowing with tears. And pretty soon she was sobbing, and we were hugging each other. It was a very important moment for me. I think in life there are times when a window opens, you remember why you love somebody so much. It was Linda's wonderful heart. And I saw it again that day. But I think it was a very, very important moment for Linda. She'd never met Ted. This was a brother-in-law she just had questions about. He was this eccentric guy living out in godforsaken Montana, but also maybe mentally ill, bizarre, maybe even a serial killer, maybe a violent person. In every sense of the word, from Linda's perspective, Ted is just out there. But I think when she heard this story, she realized that Ted was in fear. There was a bond between us as brothers that would never be broken as long as we lived. And I think it was her first glimpse that Ted was a human being. He's this nice little kid who was looking out for his baby brother, who had compassion and concern for people. And it was just the immensity of this tragedy, what it meant for us, what it meant for our family, that caused her to sob and cry that day. If you think about it, realizing that Ted was a human being did not make our dilemma any easier. It really intensified it because we found ourselves in a position, if you think about it, believe me, we were thinking about it, where anything we did, any choice we made could lead to somebody's death. If we said, hey, it's my brother, I'm going to protect him no matter what. What if Ted was the Unabomber? What if he killed again? If that were to happen, we'd go through the rest of our lives knowing really the blood of some innocent person in our hands. We would feel the guilt and the responsibility that we had done nothing. On the other hand, there was also the realization that the Unabomber had committed capital crimes. If you made a short list back then of who deserved the death penalty, probably Timothy McVeigh would have been at the top of that list. But the Unabomber, if they ever get that SOB, is going to be number 2. What would it be like? I had to ask myself to go through the rest of my life with Ted's blood on my hands. And I remember Mom saying, "You must never abandon your brother. That's what he fears the most." I thought about the effect on Ted. Obviously devastating. The effect on me, the guilt. But even more than me and Ted, I thought about Mom. At this point, she's a 78-year-old widow. For years and years and years, she worried about her elder son. But believe me, her worst nightmare about what could be like Ted's problem didn't come close, remotely close to what we were struggling with, that he might be this thinking about. You know the choice we made. I don't know. It's been like 11 years, and sometimes people will ask me, well, how did you make that choice? And it's a tough dilemma. How did you resolve it? And I think you can answer that. The human conscience isn't like a computer. It's not like you can put in a bunch of data and spit out a result. It's the kind of choice where you invest everything you have of yourself and try and struggle to find the answer. Just hope you found the right answer. I think for Linda and me, it was the feeling that if some other person were killed and we allowed that to happen, everything we believed and wanted to be and stood for in our lives would be gone. It would be revealed as a lie, that if we were able to stop the violence, we had to do it. And so we made a decision to contact the FBI. We also had to make a decision about whether to tell Mom what was going on. And I think Linda and I both agreed that we probably shouldn't. I mean, on one hand, Mom was anxious about Ted. She worried for years, and we kind of thought, well, what if they find out he's innocent? Do we really want Mom to struggle with this for months and months and months before they find the truth? Do we want her to lose sleep? And I was afraid Mom would maybe die of a heart attack or a stroke. I mean, it would be too much for her. I underestimated my mother. You'll see when I tell the rest of the story. But I so desperately wanted to protect her as long as I possibly could. Anyway, we went to the FBI. At first, they were only mildly interested. We didn't have evidence. Over time, the more we gave them, there was one particular agent, a psychological profiler, who got very, very interested. Ultimately, Linda and I were called down to Washington, D.C. We met with 3 agents in a hotel room. Had to be kind of hush-hush because this was such a big case and everything had to be done secretly. And just when I was sitting there, I almost felt like I was sitting with a therapist, because she's asking me all these very personal family questions. I'm expecting they're looking for evidence. No, they're looking for psychology. I probably wouldn't have told some of these things even to a therapist. Here I am telling them to the police because we were so resolved that we needed to stop the violence as we could. The collaboration with the FBI lasted a couple of months. I remember at one point, one of the agents sitting with me and saying, David, I know this is so difficult for you. You have to consider the possibility that your brother will actually be better off in prison than he is living the way he is. And she went on to describe the mental health treatments, wonderful mental health treatments. I hope they exist. I'm a little skeptical now. The treatments that exist in federal prisons. Talked about other notorious people who have been arrested with mental disabilities, how they seem to be happier in prison. And I just hoped and prayed she was right. But after about 2 months of working steadily with the FBI, I got the call I was dreading, the call that I hoped would never come. The agent called me and said, David, we've done everything we possibly could to rule out your brother as a suspect. Unfortunately, he's moved to the top of our suspect list. We're really at a place in the investigation where we need to speak with your mother. Do you think you could arrange an interview for us? So here I am a couple of days later walking up the steps to Mom's apartment, knocking on her door. I'm heavy heart. How am I going to tell her this? She opens the door, takes one look at me and said, oh my God, Dave, you look terrible. Did something happen? And I said, Mom, I think you better sit down. Whether it was just years and years that she worried about Ted or a kind of special mother's intuition, that's where she went. She said, oh my God, did something happen to Ted? Is Ted okay? And I said, Mom, as far as I know, he's in good health, but I think you better sit down. It's going to take a little explaining. So Mom sat down in this little lazy boy chair in her living room. I always picture her in that chair for some reason, watching television or reading a book or in a conversation with us. I'm much too agitated to sit down, like I'm kind of pacing the floor back and forth and trying to think to myself, is there some way I can deliver this news that doesn't just absolutely crush her? And so I begin seeing if she knows anything about the Unabomber. She doesn't know much. She's heard something about the Unabomber. So then I talk about places the Unabomber had been, and I mentioned places Ted had been. And I talked about the Unabomber's manifesto and its critique of technology, and then of course, I talked about Ted's views on technology. Mom just got very, very quiet. I see her kind of just staring at me with this fixed look of horror on her face, not saying a word. And I'm beginning to feel, well, put it this way, I knew that Mom loved me with all her heart. I knew she loved Ted with all her heart. What I really couldn't predict was how she could put this together. Whether she could begin to understand or deal with it or believe it. So I couldn't predict how she would feel about me turning Ted. I wasn't sure. I couldn't tell myself I was sure. that she would still love me after I told her that I'd gone to the FBI. Anyway, by this point, I'm like crying a little bit. And I said, Mom, I'm just so concerned. I'm frightened that Ted might be involved in some way. Mom, I've actually shared my suspicions with the FBI. They're actually in the process of investigating Ted to see if he might have some involvement in these violence. And I'll never forget what Mom did next. Linda and I had the luxury of time. It's like we could sort of discuss this with each other. We had weeks to think about this. How do we handle this? What do we do? Is it real? Is it not real? None of that changed anything. It was like sort of watching a car wreck in slow motion. Nothing could change, but at least we had time to sort of adjust to it. For Mom, this was like sprung on her in an instant. And how she was able to be prepared to do this, I don't know. But what she did, she got up out of the chair. She's a very small woman. I'm a little bit over 6 feet tall. She's a little bit under 5 feet tall. But without saying a word, she just walked up to me. She reached her arms up and put them around my neck. It's like the first time I left home to go to college or something. She just kind of pulled me down so she could reach my cheek to put a kiss on my cheek. And the first thing she said was, David, I can't imagine what you've been going through. Extraordinary to me. It must have been a devastating moment for her, almost worst moment of her life. And here she is concerned about how I've been doing. And the next thing she said were the most comforting words I could have heard. She said, David, I know that you love Ted. I know that you wouldn't have done this unless you felt that you had to. And with those words, I realized I hadn't lost her love. That now Linda, Mom, and I will face this difficult situation together. But Mom was where I had been when Linda first came to me. She said, David, Ted's never been violent. You know that, right? And, he's always loved animals. He's a soft spot for vulnerable people and children. Ted's good at this. You know what? They're going to investigate it. They're going to find out Ted is completely innocent. You'll see all of this is going to go away like a bad dream. And I said, Mom, I sure hope you're right. There's something else I've got to tell you. The people from the FBI really want to speak to you. Would you be open to that? She said, well, I'll follow your advice. What do you think? I said, Mom, I think you should speak with them. She said, well, when do they want to speak to me? I said, Mom, they're actually waiting outside. And probably their strategies, they didn't want to give her too much time to think about it, whatever. But I called them on their cell phone, and they came up the stairs. There were 3 agents, and come into Mom's living room and kind of sit down. Now, Mom is Mom, so maybe in a moment like this, you rely on instinct. And her instinct is, I have visitors. What does that mean? I gotta get them coffee. So she goes into the kitchen. She's making the coffee, but I think she's buying time too. She's the wheels are turning. She comes back. She's not only got coffee on the plate, but some cookies, and she's putting it down for the agents. I don't think they were in an easy situation either. How do you talk to a mother about her son, who's a suspect in a criminal investigation, especially a murder investigation? I would have to say they were very professional. They were very polite. They treated my mother with respect. They didn't have a search warrant. This wasn't like strong arm tactics. They just said, Mrs. Kaczynski, do you have anything that could help us carry the investigation forward? Anything like family pictures? Anything typewritten your son might have sent you? The manifesto had been produced on a manual typewriter so that they were interested in that. Letters your son might have sent you over the years. I said, yeah, a whole trunkload of stuff. And I keep souvenirs from David and Ted in this big trunk. She sent me to her closet to pull out the trunk. I didn't even know if they'd make them anymore. The big sort of wooden trunk with brass fittings, and I kind of dragged it out into the middle of the living room floor and opened it up. And picture yourself, Mom is this tiny woman, frail. She gets down on her knees. She's reaching down into the trunk. And, the agents are, did we see that? And she pulled up packages of letters. She had them all arranged in chronological order. There was one she picked out, and she had it specially marked because it was a letter in which Ted once said to them, "You're the best parents anybody could ever get." And she treasured that letter. So different from the later letters she had gotten. She took out, they asked to see photographs of the family. And what happens when you put together a mom with family photographs? You get stories, right? And so mom is telling these stories of camping trips and holidays, but I also could tell mom has an agenda. She's telling stories, but in effect, what she's trying to say, you're looking for the Unabomber. You're looking in the wrong place. Look, we're a good family. Ted was a good kid. We did all these very normal things. You're not going to find the Unabomber in our family. At one point, she reached down into the box and pulled out a little blue book. She held it up to the agents, and she said, "This is Ted's baby book. It's a diary I kept during the first year of his life. Would you like to see this?" And of course, I knew what she wanted him to see. She wanted him to see those entries around Ted's hospitals. She wanted him to know that Ted had struggled. I'm staying a little bit apart, but my heart is breaking. My mother is so brave, and here she is advocating for her son, and she wants those agents to know. The poignancy of that gesture wasn't lost on me. In effect, she was saying, if you're looking for the Unabomber, we'll do anything in our power to help you catch the person so that the violence can end. And don't forget for a moment, this is somebody we love. This is a family member. It's a little baby that came out of my womb 52 years ago. There's a human dimension to this tragedy. And of course, she began to talk about Ted's hospital experience. But part of what was breaking my heart was the realization, this is the legal system. This is the criminal justice system. These are police. This baby book means a lot to a mother. Does it really mean anything in a court of law? Does it save Ted's life? Probably not. Ted was arrested about a week later. I actually was at work, and I got a call from CBS News, and then a couple of more calls. And I said, you must have the wrong number, but I knew something was up. So I called Linda at her job. I said, I think Ted might be, something's happening, and they need to arrest Ted. I think we better go and protect Mom. So, within an hour, we were sitting on the couch. We were trying to talk to her. She hadn't been watching the TV, but we turned it on, and pretty soon, there's, it's the worst nightmare you can imagine. They say after 17 years, they finally arrested a suspect in the Unabomber case, and it's Theodore Kaczynski of Lincoln, Montana. And to hear our family name Kaczynski, it's like we kept this secret. I guess the family had sort of kept this secret, maybe even from itself, of Ted's illness, and then we had to keep the secret of what we suspected, and then we shared that secret with the FBI, and they agreed to keep it secret until the investigation was complete. But now here it was the national media, international media, and the name Kaczynski, and the realization from this point forward in time, that name wasn't going to mean anything good. Forget that our parents were wonderful parents, good people with wonderful values. None of that would be associated with the name Kaczynski. Now the association would be with murder, violence, and madness. That was shocking. It wasn't too long after that we saw a film clip of Ted being arrested. Some of you may have seen how he was being let out of his cabin between the two federal agents. And his glazed look at his face, but his appearance was awful. I mean, I've never seen a street person who looked worse. His clothes were utterly rags and filthy. He hadn't bathed in many months. And, part of my heart was just reaching out there. Oh, Ted, I wish I could be with you. I wish we could be with you. I wish we could say we love you. And of course, you hear suspect, terrorism, Unabomber, the whole world is watching this with a different pair of eyes than ours. It wasn't very long before the parking lot outside Mom's house was filled with media. And I noticed this big piece, but why are they here? We had received a promise from the FBI that they would never reveal our role in the investigation. They actually put that in writing. You'll be a nobody will ever know that you turned in your brother. Probably naive, because they were standing rather very soon, and an interesting sidelight in this case, apparently Kaczynski was turned in by his own brother, David Kaczynski. The family lives in Schenectady, New York. We believe they are holed up in Wanda Kaczynski's apartment. They refuse to come out, but we can show you their apartment, and all of a sudden we're looking on TV. There's a picture of Mom's apartment building, and it's bizarre. It's surreal, like, you know, the world, our world had just gone crazy for us. And there was a kind of standoff for a long period of time. I think for about 10 days, almost 2 weeks, the reporters wouldn't leave. They wanted a picture of us, they wanted a statement from us. I didn't think they were entitled to it. Believe me, we didn't even have words to tell them what we were feeling. You know, we were in shock. It was beyond words. And sometimes we would turn on the TV to try to figure out what's going on. And, you know, that was when we found out that apparently when they went into Ted's cabin, they found not only lots of incriminating evidence, but they found underneath his bed this wooden cot where he'd been sleeping without a mattress, wrapped in a package, another live bound, apparently ready to be mailed to someone. So there was no question that Ted was the person that they had. You know, there would begin to be questions like in the media. They got a big story and they got to fill it. You know, there's not a lot to say, so they get on psychologists and different people and various experts. You know, the question came up, well, what kind of a strange family must have given rise to the Unabomber? It must be one pretty peculiar family. And then there was even some speculation. There was this local talk radio guy in Albany who was absolutely convinced I would turn to my brother for the reward. There was a big reward. And I can tell you how painful it was to hear that stuff. And it almost felt like our lives were over. It's like, how could we ever leave our home? We'd always forever be family members of a notorious serial killer. I would also be known as a snitch, somebody who turned in his own brother. David Letterman called me the Unisnitch. Really, really painful stuff. You know, I thought, wow, I can't see any future for us at all. I guess we were just trying to get through the next day. Through this period of time, letters started to come through our mail slot, and lots of letters after a while. I'd say within the first month, we probably got close to 1,000 letters. And for about the first week, I didn't even want to open them. I heard about hate mail. I thought it would be mostly hate mail. I didn't want to read any of it. And then I decided to take a risk and open the letters. And what are people really thinking about this? And I opened another letter, and I kept opening letters. And I want to tell you, in 10 years, we've never got a single piece of hate mail. All of the letters we received were like, thank you for, it must have been such a difficult situation. We've got many, many letters from people who have family members with mental illnesses. We've got people who have mental illnesses. All of the letters were letters of compassion, letters of understanding. People sort of had empathy and connected with us. And to me, that was an amazing, amazing thing. I can't, thank people enough for having let us know how they honestly felt and how they held us in their hearts and in their prayers. I think, I felt very betrayed by the leak to the media that I had turned in my brother. I thought if Ted were ever to know, I would want to be the person to tell him. I want to choose the time, the place, the words, and instead he found out from his lawyer. So that was not positive. Also, there was all this media pressure. All of a sudden, our family was in the limelight almost as much as Ted was because he wasn't communicating. He was locked up. So I felt betrayed by that. But the biggest sense of betrayal I felt was about a month and a half later. The prosecutor in the case hired a forensic psychiatrist to evaluate my brother. Now, he obviously was guilty. The only question remaining for the criminal justice system was whether the Unabomber lives or dies, and it all hinged on the question of his mental status. The agents had acknowledged to me he's ill. We know he's ill. We've known he's ill even before we knew it was Ted. We knew it from his letters. So I thought there was real hope his life could be saved. Well, let me tell you about the psychiatrist the government hired. He's a guy named Tark Dietz. He travels around the country. He almost always testifies for the prosecution. He loves high-profile cases and big fees. He always either minimizes or denies the mental illness of the criminal defendant. You may remember the case of Andrea Yates. Do you remember the woman in Texas who had profound delusions caused by paranoid schizophrenia who had drowned her 5 children, believing it was the only way she could save them from the devil? Tark Dietz, at her capital trial, death penalty trial in Texas, testified that her killing of her 5 children one by one was a calculated act to had nothing to do with her mental illness. Fortunately, he also said some things that turned out to be not true. The verdict was overturned. The second jury actually looked at all the evidence minus some of Deet's testimony, although he testified again and found her not guilty by reason of insanity. So maybe we're making some little sort of progress of awareness and understanding and empathy in our culture. But at this point, I felt terribly betrayed. I felt, our family looked at the truth, when the truth is very, very painful to look at. We faced it. We came forward for entirely humanitarian motives, for justice and humanity, and so nobody else would be hurt. And they didn't hire Park Deets to help the jury understand my brother's mental illness. They hired Park Deets so that the jury would dismiss my brother's mental illness. And to me, that was devastating. It was my first awakening, that the criminal justice system isn't always about justice, and sometimes truth is a casualty within that system. How am I doing time? So I guess I have more time. It was about 2 years before the trial. Mom, Linda, and I really worked himself, so his lawyers could never say he was ill. The judge sort of hemmed and hawed about that, and then in the midst of his trial, it suddenly became surfaced. The prosecution, for the first time, offered a plea bargain. They could give Ted life imprisonment without parole. No guarantee of treatment, no guarantee of nothing, just that he wouldn't be put to death. Ted took the plea bargain. His lawyers thought he might not. He took it for one reason, so he wouldn't have to go through a trial in which his mental illness would be exposed. That evening, Mom and I were sitting in the apartment. For us, we learned that Ted was, we're never going to have to face that day where we're looking up at the clock and it's hands are approaching midnight and Ted's going to be killed. So there was some relief, but there was no joy. But some relief, that moment would never come. I guess there was also a sense of trepidation, kind of like, we've been consumed with this mission to save Ted's life. Now we've got to figure out how to live the rest of our lives, haunted by this shadow. Anyway, the phone rang, and I picked it up, and it turned out to be a law enforcement chaplain working for the Sacramento Police Department. And she let Mom and me know that there was a victim family that wanted to meet with us, wondered if we'd be open to that. And I said, Mom's been through a lot. Could they maybe wait a few days? But I'll ask her. I thought, Mom's just been emotionally drained through this, but I went to her and she said, okay, we should. If they're asking to meet with us, it's the least we can do. Yes, let's go. So I went back and called the chaplain and made the arrangements. She came and picked us up at the apartment. Drove us back to the courtroom. By now it was evening, so the courtroom that had been alive and buzzing with media and activity all that day was now quiet and dark. And she led us to a side door, and we walked down the hall to a conference room. As Mom and I walked through that door, we see that there are 5 chairs arranged in a circle. 2 of the chairs are vacant. Obviously, they're waiting for Mom and me. But the other 3 chairs have the widow of somebody that Ted had killed, her sister, and her husband, late husband's sister. So as Mom and I walk in the room, there's really only one thing we could say, which is, we're sorry. Oh, we're so sorry. And Mom started to cry. I have to say, even to us, those words sound hollow. Because they were just words, Words can't bring back, can't undo any of the damage that was done. We hope they would recognize that we meant them very sincerely. But we didn't know. Anyway, I sat down, Mom and I sat down, and the widow speaks to us. She said that during this trial, the 3 of them had been talking about it. They thought there might never, ever be another opportunity in this lifetime to speak to us personally, and they wanted us to know how grateful they were to us for turning Ted. And that's the point in which I sort of started crying out. To me, it was amazing. If you think of it, this woman had learned this very day that the man who had murdered her husband would most likely die a natural death in prison. And here she has like the emotional space, the resources, like the grace of humanity to kind of take the time to thank us. To me, it was so poignant. It meant so much to us. She even said, I can't imagine how painful it must be to have to turn to someone you love. And we ended up kind of standing up and hugging, and we sat back down, and I wanted them to know something too, and it probably wasn't the best time or place, but think of it, she's a mother, she has something that she really wants to say, and she wants them to understand that her son is not a monster, but a man with a serious, serious mental illness. And so she begins talking to them about mental illness, schizophrenia. And as I'm looking into the faces of the three women, I see them, their bodies kind of stiffen, their faces kind of harden. And I realize this is not going over too well. Mom wanted to tell them one thing. What they were hearing was somebody making excuses before the man who had murdered their loved one. And sure enough, after 5 minutes or so of this, the widow she kind of blurted out, she said, he knew what he was doing. And all of a sudden, Mom stopped talking. The room was suddenly frozen in silence. It seemed like, wow, we'd reached a place where we couldn't go any further. It was almost like we'd come the best of our humanity and the best of intentions to come closer to this other hurting family. But as we came closer, we found that between us there was this tremendous abyss of pain, loss, and trauma. You could see the faces of the people on the other side of that abyss, but there was no bridge to the other side. No way to really, any of us, to walk in each other's shoes. And it almost felt like we failed. There's some divides that you can never cross. And maybe we just go home and realize that we hadn't been able to accomplish any reconciliation. Mom kind of dropped her head, and she said, I think just what came to her mind, that it was the most natural and honest thing she could have said. It was a very poignant thing she said, though, too. She said, I really wish you'd killed me instead of your husband. And I think, all Mom had ever wanted in her life, she was a mother before she was anything. I think my father, too. That was really what they dedicated their lives to their children. And I think all Mom had ever wanted was for her kids to be happy. And if it had all been a failure, her son was miserable, her other son was miserable, and created untold misery for other people. I think she felt a failure as a mother. I think if she could have laid down her life to erase even one small part of the pain intended to cause, she would have gladly done it. And so she said, I wish she'd killed me. But I happened to be looking into the widow's face when Mom said that, and I saw some of the hardness melt. She's obviously very affected by Mom's pain. And she got out of her chair. She knelt down right in front of Mom's chair. She put her hand up on Mom's shoulder very gently, and she looked her in the face and she said, oh, Mrs. Kaczynski, please don't blame yourself. Don't think even for a minute that we hold you to blame for any of this. Don't ever think that. You read sometimes, in fact, one of the happy parts of the story, I'm now very close friends with one of my brothers. Surviving victims. We're actually writing a book together. And Gary Wright of Salt Lake City, Utah. It's like, and I believe me, I don't use the term lightly, like a brother to me. But it's a human possibility. It's not a matter of course. We're not talking about some wonderful forgiveness here, but we're talking about a moment of honesty and dignity and humanity. And I would say grace too. And I have to say, coming out of this whole ordeal, what I believe in, what I don't believe in, what I'm skeptical of. I guess I'm skeptical of the criminal justice system. I think we have a long way to go to reform it, to inject humanity into it, to inject justice into it, to make sure the truth is always heard. But I tell you, I learned things about what human beings are capable of that I'll never forget. I learned it that night. I've learned it since. I met so many families and individuals struggling with various issues, whether it's a murder, whether it's a chronic illness. There is a part of the human spirit that's very, very powerful and strong. The best of us is unbelievably good, unbelievably good. And I guess let's circle back to the whole issue of NAMI and what all of you are doing and why you're here. It's to create this sense of community. It's meant to foster this vision of humanity and love and respect. And if we don't go in that direction, if we chase these false directions of fear and hatred, let's choose the right way. Let's choose the right thing. Thank you so much.